Okay, this video today is with Richard Earnhardt and Professor Stephen Keen. I'm going to be clear and state how President of the United States, by the name of Donald Trump, has turned the world upside down, caused immense pain and suffering for many peoples due to his ignorance and not understanding cause and effect. What is really tragic is that within this administration, there are educated people, but for whatever reason, they fail to realize that their actions do not benefit the American people, do not benefit people in the world in totality, nor provide a moral compass as the leaders of the free world that the Americans have purported to be or not to be. And that is the question. False kings? That's another question. America is acting in the manner that would be expected of a country in the early 1800s. Just clubbing people. Just seal clubbing is really what they're doing. That's with tariffs, economic warfare, and kinetic warfare that is nonsensical, not logical whatsoever, and does not benefit society. It's backwards. For whatever reason, in 2026, the privilege that the world has bestowed upon the American country and people as a result of the Bretton Woods Agreement at the end of the Second World War has been horribly abused by the American country, and in particular, this American president by the name of Donald Trump. We're going to go into this video and I'll explain in more detail. We're going to talk about tariffs, trade deficits, and where it's gone horribly wrong. Let's move to our next screen.
Well, maybe now would be a good time to pivot slightly to talk more about the economics of Trump and the United States and our position more broadly. And Trump's tariffs, trade deficits have been a major topic of this term. I don't know what you think would be the best way to start talking about this, whether it would be more interesting to hear what the standard take on tariffs and trade deficits is and where you disagree with that more generally, or to just hear about how you would evaluate Trump's policies in this.
Oh, well, let's go for the theoretical side. First of all, they're talking about Trump gets to be boring. The basic position of the economist is the theory of comparative advantage. And that said, the economy should specialize on what they're comparatively better at. Okay, not the ones you're absolutely better at, but the ones you're comparatively better at. And that's bullshit. Okay, the theory that was the person who gave us that theory was Ricardo in his Principles of Political Economy back in 1817. And Ricardo, I wouldn't quite call him a con artist, but Schumpeter said that Ricardo was somebody who really didn't care about the interconnectedness of everything. He wanted to get short, simple explanations for things which would lead to the outcomes he wanted to have. So in the case of the argument about comparative advantage, he gave this numerical example of Portugal versus England and said that England takes, say, 80 people, say 120 people to make a certain amount of wine and 100 people to make a certain amount of cloth. And then Portugal takes, 90 to make a certain amount of wine and 95 to make cloth or something. They want the exact numbers, but in the case of it says Portugal's absolutely better at making both, but England's relatively better at making cloth, and therefore England should specialize in cloth, and Portugal should specialize in wine. There'd be more of both, and we trade the surplus, and everybody comes out ahead. That's the basis of the theory of comparative advantage. Now, the example that Ricardo used was simply in terms of labor. Okay, so you move workers from wine production to cloth in the UK and from cloth production to wine in Portugal. But you can't make wine just with labor, nor can you make cloth just with labor. You've got to have machinery as well. And Ricardo discussed the question of moving capital from one industry to another, and he pulled a con job. And I'm the first person to see this. It'll be something which is a surprise for most people. So I haven't got that quote handy at the moment, but I'll find it quickly for you. Give me a section to find this.
Now, while you're looking it up, does the con job you discovered arise from your attention to system dynamics?
No, it was my attention to language. Because I've always seen through the theory of comparative advantage on the basis that it presumes you can move labor from one sector to another, but ignores the fact you need machinery as well. And of course, you can't change a wine press into a spinning jenny. Okay, so if you decide to have specialization in one sector or another, you're ignoring the fact you maybe can move the workers from one sector to another, but you can't move the machinery. And I've always been aware of that.
I'm guessing it goes beyond just machinery. You also have to take into account the inputs to the labor and whether they're easily acceptable.
Well,
so
labor they do take into account. Okay, so like this is the example from Ricardo. He says, so you have to produce the wine, and England may be so circumstanced that produce the cloth may require 100 men and wine 120. Then Portugal, 80 for producing the wine and 90 for producing the cloth. He said, would that be advantageous for her, Portugal, to export wine in exchange for cloth? And then he goes through and talks about a few more examples, and finally says, the difference in this respect between a single country and many is easily accounted for by considering the difficulty with which capital, so he's now talking about machinery, or finance, capital moves from one country to another to seek a more profitable employment, and the activity with which it invariably passes from one, what should I say next? What should be the next word? Should be industry, shouldn't it? Because he's talking about changing from cloth to wine. He says province. Okay, so at this point, Ricardo is pulling a Swiftie. He knows he's pulling a Swiftie because he's ignored the fact, as well as moving the labor, you've got to move the machinery. And he starts giving an explanation for it, but gets to the point where he should say industry, or in his terminology, the words he used at the time, he would have said branches of trade. Rather than saying that, he says province. Now, of course, you can move a machine from one province to another, or you can move money from one province to another. That's got bugger all with moving machinery from producing wine to machinery producing cloth. And he got away with that for over 2 centuries. I'm the first person to notice it. Noticed it about 6 months ago. So elsewhere in the principles, he says how difficult it is to move dedicated machinery from one sector to another. And said often if you have he said an advanced economy is often in a worse situation than a backwards economy, because an advanced economy has lots of specialized machinery which cannot be moved, whereas the developed countries have less of that and can therefore move working capital, money that you use to pay workers' wages, easily. But he literally says at one point, he acknowledges you cannot turn a wine press into a sheep dip, a wine press into a spinning jenny. But fundamentally, that's what the assumptions of neoclassical economics do. Because they took this, Ricardo's idea of reallocating existing resources and made that into the whole basis of economics, as if you can reallocate workers. It takes a bit of labor training, but you can turn a vigneron into a shepherd. Okay, not impossible. You cannot turn a wine press into a spinning jenny. So there's going to be capital written off in that process, and it's really not a question of the existing resources you get. It's whether you produce new resources, whether you make, if you're looking at England, you've got to be producing more spinning jennies. Portugal, you may be making more wine presses. Does the change the financial consequences of the trade development enable you to produce more of those at the right time or not? It's a question of investment, and that's completely ignored by the mainstream. And this is why they come up arguing for something which, as if it's always unconditionally increases welfare. That's the attitude that economists have to free trade. And whereas this case, it depends upon what happens with the investment rates in the different countries. So it's a conditional question, and it doesn't relate to existing resources. It relates to investment in creating new resources. So there's just a con job at the heart of conventional economics. And originally, I didn't expect Ricardo to be conscious of that, but I was amazed to find this word when I went back to check the literature before I started working on my critique of MMT on trade. And I found that, Ricardo was quite happy to pull a con job, but he wasn't happy to stick his neck out and pretend that you can move a wine press to make it into a spinning jenny. He wasn't going to make that stupid a comment, but he got away for 2 centuries now with people not noticing, apart from me, about 6 months ago, that he's using provinces for geographic movement, where he's really talking about moving capital goods from one industry to another.
So leaving Trump out of this for the moment, what are the just general implications of this for, trade deficits today?
Well, for trade deficits, for trade in general, it means the trade doesn't necessarily increase welfare. The argument that neoclassicals have that free trade will necessarily make things better, that's wrong. Okay, so you can say it's no longer unconditional, and it's not a case of moving existing resources. It's a case of creating new ones. That's what's going to give you any benefit from trade, if at all. So it throws that argument out the window, and it also throws out so much else of mainstream economics, because they keep on pretending that you can easily move capital from one sector to another. Well, no, you can't. So it's very destructive of conventional thought on what maximizes output from economists. And in terms of trade deficits and trade surpluses, it comes down to saying that it's sensible to run a trade surplus, because that trade surplus creates additional money that you can use to invest in expanding your industries. So trade surpluses, and this is something that Keynes claimed, trade surpluses benefit the country running a trade surplus and damage countries that are forced into a deficit, because the sum of all exports and imports is zero. So countries running a trade surplus get more funds to invest and develop more rapidly. And that's, and because MMT has this, frankly, stupid argument that exports are a cost and imports are a benefit. So they're completely wrong on that front, whereas they're quite right about government spending.
And so when the United States consistently runs a trade deficit, what's actually happening in terms of our money and industrial capacity and our debt?
The trade surplus sends overseas money that's been created in America. Okay, and this is something I've had an argument with Warren Mosler on this front. He waves his hands about and says that it's just a case that they get bonds in a foreign currency. That's all that happens. When you do the accounting properly, and of course I have done the accounting properly, you can show that the exports will boost the domestic money supply of the exporting country and reduce the money supply of the importing country. And the companies, because it's companies that export, not countries, the companies that get the export get higher revenue, which means they can invest more and potentially maintain their lead over the countries where the importing is taking place. So this is what's been happening with America ever since its trade deficit started. It had a huge trade surpluses, of course, when it became the reserve currency for the planet, because that was in the aftermath of World War II, and America was the only major economy that hadn't been bombed. So it had a huge capacity to produce goods for exports, and that's what it did in the first 20 years or so after World War II. But from the 1960s, late 1960s on, it's been running a trade deficit. And one of the reasons for that is if you're a reserve currency, your currency gets overvalued. Okay? People need your currency not just to buy American goods and services, but to buy goods from anywhere else on the world. So you have a monetary demand for the American dollar over and above the demand that exists for other countries' currencies, which is mainly for trade. And that means the American dollar is overvalued. Now that suits the finance sector, fine. The finance sector, insurance and real estate, they do very nicely out of an overvalued dollar because they're the ones who can supply the dollars, so they end up dominating financial transactions around the planet. But the manufacturing sector gets a handicap. So if let's just say the overvaluation due to being the world's reserve currency is, say, 30%. So American manufacturing prices end up being 30% higher than comparable manufacturing systems elsewhere in the world. That means that America can't compete in manufacturing. So the goods and services start being made in other countries. And this, I think, ultimately leads to the decline of the country, because the reason you become an empire is because you build a manufacturing capability that other countries don't have. You make weapons they can't make. You invade and dominate them, and then you become the dominant country on the planet. That then means your currency gets overvalued if you're stupid enough to make your currency into the reserve currency. So then in that case, having dominated the world by having a new manufacturing system that enables you to invade other countries, I'm thinking everything right back to the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch empires. But they get an advantage initially that gives them the capacity to become militarily dominant. Their currency then becomes the currency for international trade. It gets overvalued. The vassal states, the ones that's defeated, start building manufacturing capability. And at some point, they build the ability to defeat the empire. And so they become the dominant country and repeat the same mistake. So I think being a reserve currency is a huge mistake for a global hegemon. And America's going through that right now. And we got this, in the case of the war with Iran, the classic part of that is that a huge part of that war involves precision weapons. And those weapons require rare earth minerals to be refined and used for magnets and all sorts of guidance. The so-called rare earths are extremely hard to refine. And does America produce them? No, China does. So America is probably going to be unable to restock its weapons after the war runs the weapons down, because China is refusing to sell those rare earth minerals to America. And so we're going to see America being unable to rebuild its military after it's wasted the weapons fighting Iran. So this is a classic instance where America is shooting itself in the foot in the short term by trying to win a war using weapons that it can't replace because it doesn't have the manufacturing capability to produce them anymore.
Okay, so we have two problems here that have created the problem we're in now in 2026. Number one is neoclassical economic theory has been flawed, has been used inappropriately, and it has created an affordability issue ever since the beginning of 1970, and Reaganism, Thatcherism, Milton Friedman have all compounded the effect of neoclassical economics on the modern world. Now, number two, which should be the number one and the most important issue, and what has caused the real problem worldwide, and it started in 1944 by the Americans and their negotiating to have an advantage in the Bretton Woods Agreement. So let's begin there now. The clash between American Treasury official Harry Dexter White, often referred to as Harry or Albert White, and British economist John Maynard Keynes defined the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference and the Bretton Woods Agreement that shaped the post-war global economy. White, the American, wanted a U.S. dollar-centered system, restrict discipline, while Keynes wanted a global clearing union to evenly balance trade. Now, the core differences in their vision: the global reserve asset. White pushed for a system anchored by the U.S. dollar backed by gold. Keynes proposed a new artificial global currency called the Bancor. And what the Bancor would have been used for was trade deficits and trade surpluses. So that would create the whole Trumpian need for tariffs because of trade deficits. Simple as that. America initially had trade surpluses, so they wanted it for their advantage. Now they're in a trade deficit situation, and they want it to their advantage again, and everybody else has to suffer due to the whims of the Americans, and the Americans not understanding how macroeconomics work for sovereign nations and Western democracies to eliminate pain and suffering and cause a situation of benevolence and abundance and harmony. So let's go back again to core differences. The global reserve asset. White pushed for a system anchored by the U.S. dollar backed by gold. Keynes proposed a new artificial global currency, the Bancor, for trade deficits, surpluses. Number 2, institutional design. White proposed, and this is the American, an international stabilization fund, which became the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, that enforced fixed exchange rates and monetary discipline. Keynes wanted an international clearing union that would penalize both trade deficit and surplus countries equally. The power dynamics, point number 3. Keynes sought to protect a financially depleted Britain and avoid giving absolute financial hegemony to a single nation. White, the American, aimed to dismantle the British imperial system and cement American global economic supremacy. Why White's Plan 1? Economic leverage. The United States held the vast majority of the world's gold and industrial capacity at the end of the Second World War, or World War II, giving White immense negotiating leverage. You got to remember, the world got the crap bombed out of it. The United States, other than Pearl Harbor, which was offshore, suffered no bombing. They've benefited, and they took advantage of that and took payment in gold every chance they could get. They took gold from everybody to compensate for their industrial complex. Number 2, political reality. U.S. Congress and political leaders favored a system built around national monetary sovereignty and the dollar, the U.S. dollar in particular, rather than Keynes' supranational global bank. And the legacy. The resulting Bretton Woods architecture established the IMF and the World Bank under American leadership. Though structural flaws in White's dollar gold standard eventually led to its collapse in 1971, and that period in time was under Richard Nixon, where the U.S. dollar was not tied to the gold standard. Everybody remembers that. So the Americans have abused the privilege of being the financial stewards of the world, and it's continually been skewered, and especially now under a guy like Donald Trump, who is a functioning illiterate, does not understand cause and effect, and doing great damage and causing pain and suffering, which is not necessary, and it really needs to stop now. Let go of pain and suffering, move to benevolence, harmony, and abundance. Questions, comments, throw in the comments section, and love and peace to everyone. Take care.